Forget everything you think you know about boundless treasure making a nation invincible. What if I told you that the greatest influx of wealth in human history was not a blessing, but a meticulously slow-acting poison? That the very mountains of silver and rivers of gold flowing from the New World into Spain's coffers didn't build an eternal empire. They systematically dismantled it from within. This isn't a story of glorious conquest, but of economic self-sabotage on a global scale. Welcome to the paradox of plunder, where having too much money doomed to superpower. This is the story of the Silver Scythe. The year is 1545. High in the cold, thin air of the Andes, an indigenous prospector named Diego Gualpa is thrown to the ground by a mighty gust of wind. Clutching at a bush to steady himself, he pulls it from the earth to reveal a glittering seam of pure, almost white metal. He has just stumbled upon Cerro Rico, the rich hill of Potosí. It is a literal mountain of silver, the largest single deposit the world will ever know. This discovery, alongside the torrent of Aztec gold and Inca treasure already flooding Seville, creates an unshakable conviction in the Spanish monarchy. God has granted them a financial miracle. For Emperor Charles V and his son, Philip II, this wealth appears infinite, a divine fuel for their grand ambitions. It pays for the invincible Spanish tercios, the mighty armadas, the sprawling palaces, and the endless wars against Ottomans, French, and Protestants. The mindset in Madrid becomes one of permanent, effortless solvency. The empire operates on a simple, intoxicating logic. When funds run low, another treasure fleet will arrive from the west. This chapter establishes the dazzling, deceptive dawn of Spain's golden age, built entirely on extractive economics and bullionism. We see the court intoxicated by the sheer volume of New World silver, believing it has unlocked a perpetual motion machine of power. The narrative, however, plants the first seed of doom. This wealth is not being created through industry, trade, or innovation. It is being taken. And an economy built on taking is an economy that has forgotten how to build. The stage is set for a catastrophic collision between this illusion of limitlessness and the inflexible laws of economics. Beneath the glittering surface of royal banquets and new cathedrals, a fundamental law of economics was wreaking havoc, one understood by few 16th-century minds. The sheer, unprecedented volume of silver and gold flooding into Spain acted like a massive, continuous injection of new money into the European bloodstream. When the amount of money in circulation increases dramatically, but the amount of goods, food, cloth, timber, labor, remains relatively stable, only one thing can happen: prices skyrocket. This was the price revolution of the 16th century, a continent-wide episode of severe inflation. In Spain, the epicenter of the bullion flood, the effect was most brutal. The cost of basic commodities like wheat and oil tripled within a few decades. A soldier's pay, a bureaucrat's salary, a king's budget, all fixed in nominal silver coins, suddenly bought far less. The infinite treasure was evaporating in terms of real purchasing power. The crown's expenses, however, were colossal and inelastic. The maintenance of a global empire, constant warfare on multiple fronts, and the lavish court. Philip II found himself in a surreal nightmare, sitting atop history's greatest fortune, yet perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy. The government's response was to seize more private treasure, levy crushing taxes on its already struggling subjects, and, most fatally, to begin borrowing against the next shipment of silver. The poison was now in the system. The wealth was physically present, gleaming in vaults, yet its economic power was melting away, creating a dangerous fiscal illusion that masked a terminal decline in Spain's real economic strength. The inflation fueled by American silver had a second, more insidious effect. It made Spanish products prohibitively expensive for everyone. Why would a merchant in Flanders buy expensive Spanish wool or iron, when cheaper, often higher quality alternatives were available from England or the Netherlands? Why would a Spanish colonist in Mexico pay for costly goods shipped from Cadiz? This strangled Spain's domestic industry and agriculture in their cradle. A phenomenon later dubbed Dutch disease took hold, where the booming, extractive sector, the silver mines, sucked all capital, labor, and entrepreneurial energy away from other productive parts of the economy. Investing in a risky textile mill or a new farm seemed foolish when you could simply get a royal license or a grant tied to American wealth. The entire nation began to reorient itself as a consumer and administrative aristocracy living off its colonial rents. Spain became a parasite on its own empire, importing the manufactured goods, foodstuffs, and even the ships it needed, paid for with raw silver. Local artisans and manufacturers went bankrupt, unable to compete with imports or afford inflated domestic costs. The economic muscles required for a resilient, modern state, diversification, innovation, competitive production, atrophied from disuse. The treasure had created a vicious cycle of dependency. It wasn't just that Spain failed to industrialize. The nature of the wealth actively prevented industrialization. The empire was becoming a hollow shell, a grandiose financial intermediary that took silver from the Americas and sent it to its European rivals in exchange for the necessities of life and war. This chapter details the deindustrialization of Spain, showing how the flood of precious metals triggered a fatal economic imbalance, making the empire not just wealthy, but profoundly weak and vulnerable to shifts in global trade it could no longer control. Confronted with soaring costs and a collapsing tax base from its crippled industries, the Spanish crown turned to the only immediate fix: more liquid capital. The Habsburg kings, especially Philip II, became the greatest borrowers in European history. They dealt with powerful banking dynasties, the German Fuggers and later the Genoese, securing massive short-term loans known as asientos. The collateral for these loans? The next shipment of silver from the Americas. This practice locked Spain into a perilous and inescapable debt spiral. The financial health of the global superpower now hinged on the timely arrival of specific fleets from Havana. A delay caused by storms, a capture by English privateers like Francis Drake, or even just slower mining output in Potosí would trigger an immediate liquidity crisis. The result was serial sovereign default. Philip II was forced to declare bankruptcy, suspending all debt payments. In 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, each default was a catastrophic earthquake in European finance. It ruined bankers, shattered the crown's creditworthiness, and forced brutal renegotiations where lenders demanded higher interest and more concrete guarantees, like direct control over American tax revenues. Each cycle diverted a larger portion of the infinite treasure to servicing old, compounding debt rather than funding new projects or productive investment. By the late 1500s, a significant percentage of every silver bar unloaded at Seville was already spoken for, earmarked for Genoese bankers before it even entered the royal treasury. The empire was now running on a treadmill of predatory credit, sprinting just to stand still. The wealth of the Indies was not an asset. It was a hostage, permanently mortgaged to foreign financiers. This chapter chronicles the Habsburg debt crisis, illustrating how the reliance on bullion created a fragile, credit-dependent state structure that was inherently unstable, turning Spain's greatest strength into its most critical point of failure. A fatal flaw in Spain's bullion-based strategy was its inability to control the silver once it entered the global economy. The crown operated on mercantilist principles, hoping to hoard precious metals. But economics defied this command. A vast portion of the Potosí silver, minted into famous pieces of 8, immediately began to leak out of Spain. Why? Because Spain was a net importer. It needed to pay for 1. Military supplies from German and Italian states, 2. Grain and naval stores from the Baltic region, and 3. The luxury goods and manufactured products it no longer produced competitively, often from its arch-rivals, England and the Netherlands. Most consequentially, Spanish silver flowed to Asia via the Manila galleons. From Acapulco to Manila, Spanish silver was traded for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices, creating a massive, sustained drain of bullion to the east. This global silver trade meant the treasure that was supposed to enrich and empower Spain exclusively was, in fact, fueling the economies of its enemies and trade partners. It financed the Dutch revolt, capitalized English privateering ventures, and strengthened the very merchant classes in Northern Europe that were outcompeting Spain. The silver became the lifeblood of the emerging global capitalist system, a system in which Spain was merely the initial, inefficient pump. It did not accumulate. It circulated, and in circulating, it empowered others. This chapter maps the outflow of Spanish bullion, demonstrating how the empire's economic model acted as a giant, inefficient distributor of capital to its competitors. The treasure was not contained. It was a tidal wave that lifted all boats, but ultimately swamped and corroded the Spanish ship of state from within, while buoying the sleeker, more agile vessels of its rivals. The infinite wealth of the New World was, of course, neither infinite nor free. It was extracted at a horrific and unsustainable human cost, which in turn created long-term economic liabilities. The Potosí mines and the Mexican silver veins were Hell's Capes. Initially worked through brutal indigenous forced labor drafts, Mita in Peru, and later by enslaved African peoples, the death toll was astronomical. It is estimated that millions perished from accidents, mercury poisoning, used in refining, and the sheer brutality of the conditions. This was not just a moral catastrophe, it was an economic one. A depopulated colony could not become a vibrant market for Spanish goods or a source of sustainable tax revenue. The colonies remained extractive outposts, not developed extensions of the homeland. Furthermore, the mining boom created distorted, dependent colonial economies that produced little besides silver, requiring Spain to provision them at great cost. The focus on plunder also stunted the development of alternative, sustainable colonial industries like agriculture or manufacturing. Spain was effectively consuming its colonial capital, both human and natural, to generate a fleeting cash flow. When the richest surface ores of Potosí were depleted by the early 1600s, production became deeper, more dangerous, and vastly more expensive. The cost of extraction began to rise just as the silver's purchasing power in Europe was falling. This chapter connects the human cost of colonization directly to economic failure. It argues that an empire built on the ruthless consumption of a non-renewable resource, both mineral and human, is doomed to peak and decline. Spain failed to invest in building productive, self-sustaining colonies that could have provided long-term stability. Instead, it mined its New World assets into exhaustion, leaving behind ecological and social ruin, and an empire with no engine for growth once the easy silver was gone. The easy wealth from America also fostered a culture of administrative inefficiency and endemic corruption that corroded state effectiveness. The Spanish bureaucracy, centered in the Council of the Indies, ballooned into a complex, slow-moving leviathan. Positions within the vast imperial administration, from viceroys to tax collectors, were often sold, venta de oficios, or given as rewards, not based on merit. This created a class of officials whose primary goal was to recoup their investment and enrich themselves during their tenure, leading to systematic corruption in Spanish America. The famous saying, "I obey but do not comply," epitomized the attitude of colonial officials toward distant Madrid's orders. Tax collection was inefficient and leaky, with vast sums lost to fraud and local graft. Furthermore, the crown granted monopolies and exclusive trading rights to favored guilds and cities, like Seville, stifling competition and innovation. The Casa de Contratación, meant to control all trade, became a bottleneck rife with red tape and bribes. This administrative paralysis had direct economic consequences. It made the empire slow to adapt, incapable of efficient resource allocation, and vulnerable to smuggling, which often benefited rivals. The silver that did reach the state was diminished by this pervasive leakage. The culture of rent-seeking, where elites sought wealth through royal favor, monopoly, and office-holding rather than productive enterprise, became entrenched in Spanish society, from Madrid to Mexico City. This chapter details how imperial overreach and bureaucratic decay, funded by American silver, created a rigid, corrupt, and inefficient state apparatus. It was an empire that was rich on paper but operationally sclerotic, unable to respond effectively to the military and economic challenges posed by more agile, less burdened rivals like England and the Dutch Republic. The treasure of the Indies didn't just pay for Spain's wars, it dictated a strategy of perpetual, unsustainable military overextension. Philip II and his successors felt they could fight everywhere at once because the silver would always cover the cost. This led to the maintenance of a global Spanish empire with endless frontiers. Against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, the Dutch rebels in Flanders, the French in Italy, the English in the Atlantic, and indigenous peoples in the Americas. The crown was engaged in a Habsburg war economy, where finance followed dynastic and religious ambition, not sound strategy. The cost was astronomical. The campaign of the Invincible Armada in 1588 alone consumed over 10 million ducats, a significant fraction of a year's colonial revenue. Maintaining the Army of Flanders was a constant, draining expense. Every military setback, like the defeat of the Armada or the loss of the Silver Fleet to the Dutch in 1628, was not just a tactical loss, but a direct financial catastrophe that triggered debt crises. The military became a voracious black hole for American silver. Worse, this strategic overstretch meant Spain could never deliver a knockout blow to any one enemy. It was stuck in multiple, costly quagmires. The wealth that was supposed to guarantee security instead fueled an aggressive, defensive posture that consumed the very resource it was meant to protect. This chapter analyzes the cost of hegemony, showing how the illusion of limitless funds encouraged disastrous strategic overcommitment. The Spanish military, though often tactically brilliant, was logistically and financially unsustainable. The empire was in a constant state of financially draining conflict, bleeding silver onto battlefields across the globe, with no peace dividend in sight, steadily exhausting the reservoir of wealth that was its sole claim to superpower status. While the silver flowed, Spain had little incentive to modernize its economic thinking or embrace new ideas. The dominant scholastic economic thought at universities like Salamanca, while sometimes insightful, was overshadowed by the practical reality of bullionism, the state's obsession with accumulating precious metals as the sole measure of wealth. There was no pressing need to develop advanced banking, credit instruments, or capital markets when the state's answer to every fiscal problem was, wait for the fleet. This intellectual complacency extended beyond economics. The Counter-Reformation and the power of the Inquisition created a climate of religious orthodoxy that was often hostile to the practical, empirical, and commercial spirit flourishing in Northern Europe. Dutch and English thinkers were grappling with joint stock companies, maritime insurance, and more efficient agriculture, the building blocks of modern capitalism. Spain, by contrast, was culturally and intellectually invested in a feudal aristocratic ideal of honor, faith, and landed wealth, reinforced by its unearned silver income. The empire failed to produce a dynamic merchant class. Its elites sought titles and royal bonds, juros, not industrial investments. This chapter explores the intellectual stagnation of the Spanish Golden Age, arguing that the very source of its wealth prevented the necessary cognitive shift towards a productive, capitalist economy. Spain was trapped in a rentier state mentality. When the silver supply eventually faltered and the wars kept coming, the empire had no intellectual or institutional toolkit to adapt. It had relied on a single, extractive trick for 2 centuries and had forgotten, or never learned, how to truly build, innovate, and compete in a changing world. In a stark symbol of its economic hollowing out, Spain became dependent on its rivals for the basic operation of its empire. By the late 17th century, the Asiento de Negros, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America, was not held by Spaniards, but by first Portuguese, then Dutch, French, and finally English traders. This meant a crucial, brutal component of colonial labor was outsourced to foreign powers who profited immensely. More tellingly, following the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, the victorious British secured the Asiento de Negros and additionally, the right to send one annual navio de permiso, permission ship, to trade directly with Spanish colonies. This legalized British smuggling on a massive scale. Even Spain's colonial trade, the heart of its mercantilist system, was being legally penetrated and exploited by its greatest geopolitical foe. Furthermore, the manufacturing goods that flooded the colonies illegally were overwhelmingly British, Dutch, or French. Spain had become a mere conduit. Its navy and administration protected the colonies, while its economic rivals reaped the benefits of supplying them. This foreign economic penetration demonstrated the complete failure of the Spanish mercantilist model. The empire was a vast, captive market it could not supply, becoming a profit center for the very nations it was fighting politically and militarily. This chapter highlights the ultimate paradox: Spain's colonial economic dependence. The system designed to enrich Spain exclusively ended up enriching its enemies more efficiently, turning the empire into a geopolitical shell whose economic vitality was increasingly controlled from London and Amsterdam, not Madrid. After the War of Spanish Succession, the new Bourbon dynasty in Spain recognized the deep rot. A series of enlightened ministers, most notably under Charles III, implemented the Bourbon reforms. These were a last-ditch effort to modernize the empire and recapture its lost wealth. They included decentralizing trade by allowing more Spanish ports to trade with America, creating powerful colonial viceroyalties, expelling the Jesuit order to seize its wealth, and strengthening the colonial militaries. The most direct financial move was increasing the crown's share of colonial revenues, quinto real, and improving tax collection. Initially, these reforms generated a notable economic revival and a final silver boom in Mexico. However, they were fundamentally administrative and extractive reforms, not transformative economic ones. They aimed to squeeze more efficiency and revenue from the old, extractive system, not to fundamentally alter Spain's or its colonies' productive base. The reforms also increased colonial resentment by raising taxes and asserting more rigid control from Madrid, planting seeds for the independence movements to come. Crucially, they did not address the core disease, Spain's lack of competitive industry. It was still a raw material exporter and a manufacturer importer. The reforms came a century too late. By the 18th century, Britain's Industrial Revolution was underway. Spain was trying to perfect a 16th-century model of bullion-based power in a world that had moved on to industrial and financial capital. This chapter assesses the failure of top-down reform, arguing that while the Bourbons made the empire more efficiently exploitative, they could not reverse the centuries of structural decay, economic distortion, and intellectual stagnation caused by the Silver Scythe. The patient was briefly revived, but the terminal illness remained. The end of the Spanish Empire as a major power came not with a whimper from silver depletion, but with a bang from foreign invasion. Yet, Napoleon's 1808 invasion and the subsequent Peninsular War were the final trigger that exploded a body already terminally weakened by centuries of economic poison. The empire was financially exhausted, its administration brittle, and its legitimacy in the colonies already strained by the Bourbon reforms. The war devastated the Spanish peninsula, destroyed its remaining finances, and, most critically, severed the direct lines of authority between Madrid and the American colonies. In the power vacuum, Creole elites in the colonies, long frustrated by Spanish monopoly and peninsular privilege, saw their chance. The wars for Spanish-American independence, 1810 to 1825, began. Spain, bankrupt and broken, could not muster the resources to suppress them. The great cycle that began with Columbus closed. The silver that had funded the empire's rise was gone, and without it, the empire could not hold. The colonies, whose economies had been shaped for 300 years to serve Madrid, broke away. This final chapter frames the Napoleonic crisis not as an external shock, but as the coup de grace. The empire had been hollowed out by the very wealth that built it. It lacked the resilient economy, the loyal colonial populations, and the flexible institutions to survive a major crisis. The Silver Scythe had cut down Spain's capacity for long-term survival, leaving a fragile structure that collapsed when finally put under decisive strain. The story of Spain's Silver Scythe is not a dusty historical footnote. It is a masterclass in the perils of the resource curse. Modern parallels are stark. The Dutch disease is named for the 1970s Netherlands, where natural gas wealth hurt manufacturing. Petrostates like Venezuela or Nigeria, despite vast oil revenues, often suffer from crippling inflation, corruption, deindustrialization, and debt when they fail to diversify their economies. The Spanish Empire is perhaps history's first and greatest example of this phenomenon. Its experience teaches that easy wealth is a dangerous illusion. It can create a rentier state that neglects the hard work of building human capital, competitive industry, and robust institutions. It shows that wealth without productivity is fleeting, and that an economy based on extraction and consumption, rather than innovation and production, is ultimately a dead end. The legacy of the Silver Scythe is a warning about the difference between money and real wealth, between cash flow and enduring power. Spain confused the shiny metal with strength, and it paid the price for centuries. Hindsight offers a painful blueprint. Had Spanish monarchs understood economics, they might have treated the New World treasure as a one-time windfall to be invested, not an income to be spent. First, they could have imposed sterilization policies, quarantining much of the silver to control inflation. Second, and most crucially, they could have invested in domestic industry, textiles, shipbuilding, metallurgy, using the capital to make Spain the workshop of its own empire, not its storefront. Third, they could have developed their colonies into diversified economies, not just mining camps, creating sustainable markets. Fourth, they could have paid off debt and built a treasury surplus instead of borrowing against future shipments. Fifth, they could have reformed the tax system to rely on broad-based domestic taxation, fostering accountability and a connection between state and productive citizenry. They could have embraced financial innovation, like the Dutch and English. In short, they needed to use the silver to build a modern, productive, capitalist economy. Instead, they used it to fund a pre-modern, dynastic, feudal state on a global scale. The tragedy is that Spain had the greatest capital injection in pre-modern history and squandered it on consumption and prestige. This chapter is a counterfactual analysis, outlining the lost opportunities of the Spanish Empire, highlighting the exact pivot points where a different choice could have turned a curse into a lasting blessing. So, what was the final balance sheet of the Silver Scythe? On one side, a two-century reign as a global superpower, a cultural golden age that produced Cervantes and Velázquez, and the spread of the Spanish language and culture across continents. On the other, economic ruin, deindustrialization, perpetual debt, military overextension, colonial collapse, and a national decline that left Spain a peripheral power in Europe for centuries. The influx of treasure created a profound national trauma, a collective memory of lost grandeur and squandered potential that shaped Spain's identity. Economically, the wealth was real, but its effects were almost entirely negative because of how it was managed. It inflated away, leaked to rivals, funded unproductive wars and corruption, and killed the incentive to build a resilient economy. The Scythe did not harvest enduring power. It cut down Spain's own future. The empire was not defeated by a more powerful foe in a decisive battle. It was slowly, inexorably consumed from within by the toxic effects of its own apparent good fortune. The lesson is timeless. True wealth is not what you have, but what you do with it. Spain had the world, and used it to buy a ticket to irrelevance. The Silver Scythe stands as history's most potent warning that the easiest money often carries the highest price. The story of Spain is the ultimate case study in how to lose a winning hand. It shows that the greatest threats to an empire are often internal, born of its own successes. The Silver Scythe wasn't a weapon wielded by Spain's enemies. It was a tool of self-destruction, forged in the minds of Potosí and polished in the palaces of Madrid. If you want to understand why superpowers fall, look not just to their battles, but to their balance sheets. The real war is often against economic gravity. If this deep dive into the financial poison that killed an empire gripped you, you must see our next investigation. We're tracking a single, notorious financial instrument that secretly fueled every major European war for 200 years, lining the pockets of bankers while millions died on battlefields. It's a story of shadowy credit, sovereign betrayal, and the hidden cost of glory. The title? The Devil's Bond, the secret debt that funded centuries of war. Don't miss it. Subscribe to Blood Money Files and hit the notification bell. The real history of money is darker than you think.